This is Greg Jones. I'm Dean of Duke Divinity School and the United Methodist Elder from the Western North Carolina Conference, listening to the Happy Jesus Show.
Thanks, Greg. Great to have you here with us in Arkansas at our annual conference. And you know, like every time someone comes into town, you've always got that family member you're a little embarrassed for them to meet. Well, for me, it's Bill, because he thinks Jesus is a hippie. And I'm just going to say, with great embarrassment, that is a true story in my life. And I'll let you comment on it however you want.
Well, it all depends on what's meant by the term hippie. There's a lot of cool stuff about hippies and cool stuff about Jesus, and the Venn diagram does have overlaps, but Jesus isn't only a hippie, he's also a lot of other things.
Yeah, I guess we've been doing this a little while now, and I think that question tells me more about what people think of hippies than what they think of Jesus. So I'm going to give you another chance. Tell me a story that kind of sums up some things you think about Jesus. It can be from the Bible, it can be from your own life. You could make up a story about a guy named Bill. I mean, just however you want to illustrate that. Something that gives us some insight into how you understand Jesus.
I think of Jesus as someone who is the paradigmatic border crosser, who just was always engaged. He never met a stranger. He was always welcoming, listening, interacting, building relationships where divisions existed in ways that I have a sense that he would have taken me places if I was walking around with him literally that I didn't plan to go or wouldn't have wanted to go, and would be surprised by the extraordinary hospitality he both received and gave.
Yeah, that is a good answer, yeah.
It's a better answer than you've ever given.
That's why he's the guest and I just ask questions. We just heard you give a talk, and you used a phrase that there's a part of everyone's soul that wants to go back to Egypt. So I'm going to let you first illustrate what that means for anyone that wasn't listening to your talk. And then I'm curious, what part of your soul wants to go back to Egypt? What does that look like for you?
Well, it's based in the story of Numbers 13 and 14, and when the Israelites spy out the promised land, and 10 of the spies come back and say, we can't go forward, there are too many obstacles, and so we better go back to Egypt. And it's that sense of knowing where God's calling us, and then this longing to go back to Egypt. And I said that my dad said that every church he ever served had a Back to Egypt committee in it, and yet there's a Back to Egypt part of all of our souls. Mm-hmm. And in my own case, it's as I get older, I'm more settled in my habits, even when they're dysfunctional. And even when I know that transformation could happen if I changed, I'm just going to stay stuck. And it's that risk aversion that leads us to stay settled in what we know how to do, even if it's dysfunctional, rather than taking risks to trust where God's calling us.
Yeah. I know my Back to Egypt story always revolves around leaving the church and going back to work at a bank. I had a nice career as a banker before I went into ministry, and that's the Back to Egypt part of me. It's like, this isn't worth it, or I don't want to do this anymore, or I'm not going to do this. I'm just going to go back to that.
For me, going back to Egypt is that dissatisfaction that comes occasionally, especially right before I have to go do hospital visits. I want to go back to my office where I'm safe and comfortable instead of getting out there and worrying about what I'm going to have to say.
So what can we do in our own lives or in the life of the Church Universal to feed our souls in a way that we don't listen to the Back to Egypt part of us?
Well, I'm going to talk about this tomorrow, that we need friends around us who know us well enough. Because usually we don't describe what we're doing as going back to Egypt. We re-describe it to make it sound noble, and you could go back to banking as an expression of your gifts, and you have a great way to describe it when you know you're really running from something if you did that. And so we need friends around who challenge us and who also affirm things they see God doing in us that we can't see ourselves. And they also help us dream dreams that might scare us. That's when I really want to go back to Egypt, is when a friend will say, you really ought to be risking a lot more than you are. And I'm thinking, no, I'm just fine the way I am. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I forget who said it, so I'm just going to take credit. But she said your mind's job is to be right, and it's really good at its job. Our mind will find reasons to support whatever we decide or tell it wants to do.
Yeah.
So, thank you for sharing that about your friends and people to...
We all need people like that around us. And we need to be like that to our friends, too.
So you also mentioned in this going back to Egypt that it's also the death of imagination, or the death of Christian imagination. Where did we lose our imagination in Christianity?
Well, it's a perpetual temptation because we have this, because that back to Egypt longing is very familiar. I haven't yet been able to confirm the research, but I was told by a nurse that there's research of people connecting to an fMRI, and they asked them to scratch old wounds until they started bleeding again. And when they started bleeding, it activated the pleasure center in the brain. That there's a kind of perverse pleasure we sometimes draw from reliving old wounds, even though it causes us pain. There's a familiarity to it that we can get caught in. And so it's a perpetual temptation for us. I think that in the 20th century and in the early 21st century, we got settled into an established mindset where we just thought our job was to care for what is, and that doesn't require a lot of imagination. And so we lost the imagination to say, well, what is always either growing or decaying, and we need to be attending to that in ways that's always about innovation, renewal, restoration, reform, all those kinds of phrases. And once we settled into that, we got a bad imagination about what it means to be a pastor. We got a bad imagination about what it means to be a congregation or a seminary. And it just stifled us until we then get preoccupied with internal things and wanting to go back to Egypt.
Yeah. In my old banking days, I used to hear lecturers talking business circuits and things, and one of them said something that stuck with me today. He goes, there's only one way to coast, and that's downhill.
Yeah.
And that is certainly what happened to our church. We got comfortable coasting downhill. And
the other phrase I like is when the phrase resting on your laurels always means you're wearing them in the wrong place.
That's a true story, too. Yeah. So our society and world are kind of shifting. I mean, we've moved from a Christendom to a post-Christendom. Technology's happening fast. How do we lead and imagine when we're not sure where we're going, or what's going to happen next?
Well, I think that, part of what I was trying to say this morning is that if we begin with the end, we at least have a broad direction of where we're going, and that is to bear witness to the reign of God. That gives us a pretty good compass that's better than if you're trying to figure out as a business just how to adapt to technology and what's the future of grocery stores or banking or whatever those examples are. So we have a clearer sense of direction in that sense. And I think also we're in a time that should be a real great opportunity for the church, because artificial intelligence and machine learning and some of the things like that are presenting new questions about what does it mean to be human. And if we can articulate that in a rich and robust way, it's what the world's actually yearning for. And so there's an opportunity for us to speak into things. We're not going to be at the cutting edge of technology or cancer research. However, we can be bringing embodied wisdom to those conversations about what it means to have a flourishing life, what it means to have a flourishing community. And there's a lot of wisdom that we can still speak into those conversations. And I think the church is better positioned in most communities to be the catalyst, the convener, and the curator of gospel wisdom across sectors and across generations.
Yeah. In a world that's all treble, we can offer some bass notes.
Yeah, that's right.
For our listeners, what do you mean by beginning with the end?
Yeah, the end is the telos, the goal, the purpose of the reign of God. That's the end with a capital E. And we're supposed to orient ourselves toward that. That which Jesus announces, embodies, and points toward is the reign of God. And that's what our life is supposed to be oriented toward that. Simon Sinek's famous TED Talk, Start With Why, is about the animating significance of answering that question, why. We've got the best why you could possibly imagine, except too many people don't realize it because they only see us with the what and the how bungling.
Going to the end, Revelations ends with the New Jerusalem coming down. So what you're saying is we need to begin imagining what it means to live in the New Jerusalem and start making it happen now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, and living in ways that people will see that. They'll be surprised by it and encouraged.
Ooh. What does that look like in your own life? Or can you tell a story of someone you've seen do that gives you hope?
Well, I'm going to tell several stories tomorrow. There's a woman who's probably the greatest inspiration for me. Her name's Maggie Barankica, who has embodied this in an amazing area for many years in rural Burundi. in the wake of a lot of problems. And the way she developed this whole initiative called Maison Shalom, the House of Peace, social entrepreneurship efforts, she said, love made me an inventor. And that, she means the story of God's love created her to be an inventor of all these new initiatives. It's just extraordinary. And when she was exiled, she had to flee because the ruler of Burundi wanted to assassinate her. And when I saw her after she was in exile in Rwanda, I thought I needed to go and console her. And when I saw her, the first thing she said to me is, "You can't stop God's love." And I just thought, well, I can. I do it with some regularity. But in her life, it's pretty powerful.
Maybe nothing can stop God's love but us.
Yes.
In our own lives, yeah.
And she's the one who inspires me because you can't make sense of her life apart from the work of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
You talked about being human in the light of Christ today, and one of the things I wrote down when you said that was that following Christ is to be extraordinarily human in the best sense. What does it look like to be human in light of Christ?
Well, I think it's to have a holistic sense of what it means to be human. Jean Vanier recently died, who started L'Arche communities, and part of the power of those was communities of living with people who have intellectual disabilities. And what he discovered was the gifts they had to offer that challenge our presumptions about rationality is what it means to be human, and the care for that. I also think about just the extraordinary ways in which saintly people can absorb evil without passing it on. And when I think of Christ, it's someone who didn't engage in a tit-for-tat kind of desire for revenge. He absorbed humanity's sin and brokenness without passing it on. That's what I think signifies what it means truly to be human. That's what Nelson Mandela did in walking out of Polmore prison. He had all the reason to be bitter and to just want to come out, guns blazing, either figuratively or literally. And instead, he charted a vision for a new South Africa.
I wonder, can you offer any insight into what allows people to absorb that without passing it on?
Well, a real healthy emotional sense of identity. I think a lot about, our educational system spends a lot of time training our minds, but doesn't do very much training our emotions. And yet, our emotions are so much a part of what drives our actual actions. And so it's a real healthy sense of emotional identity. And it's a set of practices. You've got to learn how, on a daily basis, to forgive and be forgiven emotionally to be ready to be able to do it in big circumstances. So it's habits over a lifetime.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I think too often we think, well, life is one or two big decisions, but for most people, it's little decisions they make every day and doing the right thing every morning. So
yeah, I think that's right.
Just moving slowly through it, baby steps.
Yeah. But we need to pay way more attention to habits. If you think about how great athletes are formed, often a lot of the time is spent in practice. And I just saw a quote that I loved. It said, all the world's a stage, and most of us are desperately unrehearsed.
I heard someone today, they asked, a flight person, why do you spend so much time in a simulator? And they said, in moments of crisis, we don't rise to the occasion, we default to our programming.
That's a great line, yeah.
I was like, what are some habits that you can see from a religious point or a leadership point that people need to work on developing?
Well, I'd start with prayer, that, most of us aren't particularly adept at prayer. And in a sense, not just of giving a list of things to God, but of actually listening to God, so that, most of my prayers are a list of what things I hope God will do, not listening to what God thinks I ought to do. And so I think you start with that sense of prayer. I also think that a willingness to listen to others and to listen deeply, not just to the words, but the song beneath the words. And I think the giving and receiving of hospitality, that learning what that really looks like in a really serious way it's part of the border crossing and perhaps even part of the hippie part of Jesus, that sense of hospitality is very surprising.
We seem to be really good as human beings of trying to make God in our image instead of living into God's image. And so what I'm hearing you saying is that we need to fall back into trying to reflect the image of God instead of reflect our own image on God.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's a sobering thing that I've done, even in well-educated congregations, to ask people, sometimes to ask clergy, if I were a Martian and just landed yesterday and I hear all this stuff about GOD, I see it on the sides of trucks where it stands for Guaranteed Overnight Delivery. So what's meant by this term GOD? And I've been struck by how ill-equipped people are to actually talk about God. And in one particular instance, I got people, they said, well, God's a force that's created things. And I said, well, let's try to work with that. Some things, all things. They didn't want to make it sound too totalitarian or something. I said some things. So I said, okay, how would you change that? They all seemed content. So then I just said, let's pray, because we were in church. They bowed their heads. I said, oh, force that's created some things. And then people looked up like, that sounds weird. But they didn't really know how to suggest something different.
Right.
That's a sign that we're not going to be focusing on what it means for us to be the image of God. That's a very different picture. We try to create God in our image.
Are we embarrassed? Are we embarrassed to claim like what it actually means for God?
Yes, I think so.
Does that make us sound silly or uneducated, or what is that?
Well, I think there's some of that, and I think we've lost a sense of what that means in prayer and conversation. I mean, actually, I had somebody say to me, so how is the Divinity School shaped by God? And I just thought, oh, well, I tend to spend our time trying to explain how we're similar to the other professional schools, but shouldn't we be more odd in the university than that? And it was a question I've thought a lot about since then, just to try to make sense of it. And I do think there's some embarrassment. I was talking to a guy who's a pastor up in the Pacific Northwest, and he said, out there it's now sufficiently secular that being a pastor is exotic. And he said, so I have to explain who I am because they think I could be like a witch doctor. Well, it actually creates really interesting conversations rather than just kind of, in the South, everybody, you say pastor and everybody nods their head. They know what that is, maybe.
Well, that means they can't cuss anymore.
That's right.
They look at me and just say, really?
Yeah.
I think you hit the nail on the head during your talk, though, today, that sense of awe. We don't have that sense of awe with God. It seems Christians have lost their sense of awe of God. And I don't know if that's because we don't really believe God does move in the world. We've become deist, or we've just kind of become a checkbox community. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it really took me aback when I was talking to a young Christian in Congo. And he's had to rebuild his health clinic 3 times. Rebels have destroyed it twice. I said, why do you keep rebuilding it on the same spot? He said, because we have to show that the forces of God are more powerful than the forces of evil. And I thought, I've never thought about anything I've done in that kind of framework. I just think, well, it's a good thing to do. We could help people. We have the resources. I go to functional terms. And when he said that, I just thought, that's really powerful. And I just thought, and I don't even talk about it. I didn't raise my kids with that kind of, sense of awe or that kind of vocabulary.
What are a couple of simple things we could do to recapture some of that?
Well, I think actually, and that's part of why I read this wonderful passage from Marilyn Robinson's Gilead about just learning to see in the light of transfiguration. That you can see God at work in all kinds of places if we only have the courage to do it and to describe it that way. And even Greg Boyle, who I'll talk more about tomorrow, who I admire hugely, and in his actual life he does it. So he offers blessings and he goes into prisons and says Mass and marks a sign of the cross on these guys' foreheads and says, if you want your life to be transformed when you get out, here's my card. Does all these things. But when he talked about his leadership of Homeboy, when I was talking to him, he said, well, I have succession already planned out. We've got people, and he just described the functional leaders for all their programs. And I said, Greg, you're missing your role as priest and as one who blesses and the role God plays in all that. And he just looked at me and said, oh, that's interesting. And I thought, no, that's basic, but it's just the way we don't see how much people are yearning for that sense of blessing, that sense of love, that sense of embrace by God. And that, the first time when I was a seminarian, I showed up in a field education placement in this rural area. I got to the door to this person who was dying of cancer, and his grandson answered the door, and he saw me at the door, and he went, "Ah!" and turned around and said, "Grandpa, God is here." And I was thinking, no, my name's Greg. I'm just, visiting. But then I thought, oh, they actually see me as an ambassador of God. 2 Corinthians says we're ambassadors for Christ. And, I'd much rather just be a pastor, in a generic sense, than to think that,
Yeah, that does feel overwhelming. And I
but it's
struggle
also
with that
very
as
basic.
well. Yeah. So I guess embracing that identity
Yeah.
is part of our calling.
Yeah, and then learning how to see that in the lives of others in that way. The kind of, are you capable of seeing God at work in someone else, especially a family member who you know really well? And, I jokingly sometimes say, family reunions are just the worst thing because everybody treats you like their age, when you were at the age where you annoyed them most.
Yeah.
And, I will never change. I hear the same stories about me at 8. And, that wasn't a particularly good year for me.
I know in my own life, I love control.
Oh, yeah.
And I wonder if part of the temptation to break it down into succession planning or to put it into business term stuff is I can control that.
Yep.
I can figure that out.
Yeah.
I can fix that. And it lets me be God.
Yep. That's why I like and hate the image of Christianity's surprise. I like it because it challenges me, because I don't like surprises. I like to be in control. I like to know exactly my schedule. I've got confirmation numbers for every trip I go on. I want life to be set. And so that sense of being out of control is disorienting. And yet that's the definition of the Holy Spirit. The one who disrupts us.
It's like the wind. You don't know
Yeah.
where it's going or where it's coming from.
Right.
Exactly.
Yep. And yet that's where transformation happens. But I'd much prefer to be in control. Annie Dillard's familiar line about, needing to wear a crash helmet when you go into worship, I love, and yet I rarely think that is likely to happen.
I guess that's part of our back to Egypt story too.
Yeah.
That part of our soul that I know what's going to happen there. I know what to expect there. I know how to control that in my own little way.
You bet. Even if it makes me miserable, it's familiar.
The devil I know.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I'm seeing a lot of that in Methodism right now. We keep looking back. Our Egypt is pre-72 when we were growing. Or you go to any church and they're going to look back to that time when they were the healthiest, in their mind, healthiest, because it looks different to them now years later. And so we've got these sunglasses on with mirrors in it, looking back constantly. And I think that's part of the reason we're in the difficulties we are right now is we haven't embraced who we are. So my question for you is, what is Methodism at its best?
Well, I do think that your point, my grandfather, who was a Methodist minister in Iowa all his life, said, as I was about to be ordained, my wife was about to be ordained, he just said to us, he said, there's nothing that accounts for a longing for the good old days quite so much as a bad memory. Now, I think that what I would say is that at our best, we're always drawing on the past, the best of the past, in ways that give us opportunities to live into the future. There's a big difference between a middle school band concert where people are just making stuff up. Nobody wants to go to that, including the parents. And a jazz concert where there's incredible gifts and skills developed and appreciation for music of the past that enables you then to improvise into the future. In response to your direct question, Methodism at its best is deeply rooted in the transforming work of God, with a robust sense of the Holy Spirit conforming us to Christ in ways that lead to experiment, mission, and innovation to address the best of the opportunities that we see before us. So we're always focused on the future. A wonderful African-American colleague reminded me once that when you're driving, the front windshield is always much larger than the rear view mirror. And it's pretty dangerous if you just focus on the rear view.
You said something there that's, I don't know, I'm having a little bit of a moment. Maybe as Methodist ministers into an uncertain time, we're called to be jazz musicians in the sense that we've so mastered the basics of Christianity that we're free to improvise and to react and to move in that moment.
Yes, I love the image, and some of my most fun times. I did an event up in Michigan with a jazz combo, and we met each other for the first time 20 minutes before we went in front of 1,000 people. And it turned out none of the jazz musicians had played with each other. Well, 2 of them had played, but the 5 had never played together. In those 20 minutes, we were able to connect on faith, on music, and plan what we were going to do, because we all had done a lot of rehearsal. And it made for this improvised hour-long presentation that was magical, because we could trust each other and knew kind of where we were going. I was scared to death, You're about to go live in front of 1,000 people, and you're meeting people for the first time, and kind of going, all right, you're going to start with Autumn Leaves, and the sax is going to go this way, and then I'll pick back up with some comments in there, going, what are your comments going to be? But there was a trust level, and beautiful things happened. And that's what a well-formed church ought to be. The pastor comes in, and if the basics are mastered, and you've got that, then you can make beautiful music together.
It's thousands or hundreds or however many hours to master the basics.
Yep, that's the principle of the 10,000 hour rule.
And then there's the trust and being willing to live into being scared to death.
Yep, my dad used to say that the church ought to be like the crazy house at the carnival. The floors are moving beneath you, the mirrors make you look funny. There are all sorts of things to disorient you, but that's why you bought the ticket in the first place. Yeah. So, being somewhat unsure and scared is a good sense. Now, there's a bad sense of being fearful that the Bible regularly enjoins us against. And yet, that nervousness, I wouldn't call it fear, it's nervousness, because you're not quite sure exactly where you're going to end up. But man, that talk with the jazz combo is one of my favorite hours I've spent in my life.
What does it look like? Because there's a real possibility of failure when you get out there and they're nervous. And how do you, embrace and live into that sense that we might fail or fail miserably or fall flat on our face?
Well, we have to distinguish between different kinds of failure. So there's failure that results because of a lack of preparation or laziness. There's moral failure. Those are not good forms of failure. And then there's the failure that's inevitably a part of performance. Yo-Yo Ma, the great cellist, said that he always looks forward to his first mistake so that then he can lean into the performance. The question is not whether you're going to fail or make mistakes. The question is how do you recover from it. IDEO's line, the design firm out in Silicon Valley, is fail quickly so you can succeed sooner. And if you start with an assumption that you're going to fail, but you try to make it survivable, so it's not a big thing, then you've got to be skilled in order to make sure that the failure is going to be survivable. But we ought to be more worried if we're never failing, because that means we're not actually growing and trying new things. We ought to be looking for constructive failures so that we can grow.
That's where we could probably learn a lot from science. Scientists often say there is no failure in science, just opportunities to learn more.
Right. Yep, that's. I think it was Einstein or Edison who said, I haven't failed. I just have 999 experiments that haven't yet worked.
Exactly.
I think it was Edison about the light bulb.
Yeah, it was Edison, yeah.
I was talking to my kids about that the other day, because they're budding artists or want to be budding artists, and they get frustrated with their drawings and stuff. So we were talking about that. And I don't know. I wonder where I lost that. Because I talk to my kids all the time about failing and the importance of failure, and these things happen. And in my own life, sometimes that's really scary, and I don't want to fail.
Yeah, and we get the wrong incentives. And part of our schooling system is designed to produce the right answer rather than to encourage a sense of experimentation and those kinds of multiple pathways. I mean, there was an interesting study done with kids where they asked 5-year-old kids, and it was about multiple pathways to a goal. And they asked 5-year-old kids, okay, so there's an accident here, and the hospital's over here, and you have to cross a bridge. What are you going to do to get the people to the hospital? And they say, well, we call an ambulance. Say the bridge is out. A car won't get across to the hospital. They say, well, we call a helicopter. There are no helicopters in the air. And they said, and eventually, they're calling in Superman or Underdog or, all sorts of things. But they've got multiple pathways to get the people to the hospital. When they did it with 5th graders, there were fewer pathways suggested. When they did it with 10th graders, there were even fewer. Because we stifle the imagination in education to say, no, there's a right answer and there's a wrong answer. And so you get more afraid to try something.
Is that maybe part of what it can be as the church to give some of that back?
I sure hope so.
As they grow up?
Yeah, I sure hope so. Yeah. I mean, part of the jazz improv work. I did another thing where 3 guys were playing and all of a sudden it was going bad. And then you had to go back to get the melody again before you could start the experiment again. And they figured out how to listen to each other and get each other back on course. And that's what friends do too, is if you have that kind of experimentation, you want people every now and go, this isn't working for you. Mm-hmm. Why don't you try that? But we usually want support because failure by yourself can be really debilitating. But failure when you're supported by friends can be transformational.
And that kind of moves into another point you made today was judgment and wonder instead of judgment. If we could live into that, I believe we'd start finding this willingness to walk the tightrope without a net.
Yeah. Yeah, because we'd have friends around us too, that would be helping us nurture that. And, I have friends who I've taught these little shorthands, to say, to move toward wonder. And then when they bring it back to me, it's really annoying because the arrow points and I was like, no, I say that to you. Let's be clear.
Yeah. I've told my office staff, I'm like, when I start moving furniture in my office, that means something's really wrong. I'm stressed. And I'm subconsciously trying to control my environment because I can't control anything else. So now they start saying to me, they're like, so Jeremy, you want to talk about it? And I'm like, no, I want to move this couch. And they're like, well, when you're done with that, can we talk about whatever you move the couch?
Well, the shorthand, my wife is a Methodist pastor and was the first woman at almost every appointment she served. And there was a story about the good old boys of a church saying when the bishop sent a woman, well, we've taken every other pastor up fishing, we'll take her up too if she'll go, but she probably won't go. And so they ask her, she says, I'd love to go. So they get up on the lake, they get out in the boat into the middle of the lake, and they realize they left the tackle box back on the shore, on the dock. And the woman pastor says, that's okay, I'll get it. She gets out of the boat, starts walking across the water back toward the dock. And one of the guys turns to the other guy and says, bad enough they sent us a woman pastor, they sent us one who can't swim. So the shorthand when somebody starts talking uncharitably in judgment rather than in wonder about another person is, oh, she can't swim or he can't swim. Mm-hmm. And the first time somebody said that back to me, I was like, no, you must understand. I use that phrase to you, not you to me. Thank you very much.
I guess that becomes like a reset button.
Yeah, and because you do it in humor, it actually gets me back to wonder. It's kind of like, oh, yeah, I was talking about that person without a sense of wonder at the gifts he brings because I've just been annoyed.
And I think the church is probably the best institution to offer judgment right now instead of wonder.
Oh, we do really it regularly.
We should really be working to reverse that.
Yeah. Well, and that's the sense of, and part of my point about Greg Boyle telling the story is he's got plenty of good reason for judgment. It's not like he's just being judgmental in a bad sense. These guys have done some terrifically bad things, but if you just focus on that, you're not going to affect change. When he started with wonder and said, how's God working in their life now and how can we make a difference in the future? It's not just being nice. That's not the solution. That sense of wonder is, how's God working in this person's life? So there's still a hope for transformation. It's rooted, though, in love.
That's another thing that happens, too, when we do wonder. Instead of judgment is we offer humanity back to people as well. Because there's nothing that strips your humanity quicker than being judged.
Right. And that also has an important impact on our own humanity, too.
Yes.
Yeah. So Bill's got this theory that most of Jesus' miracles were about restoring people's humanity and restoring them back to community. You're a New Testament guy. You want to weigh in?
Oh, I think that's right. Well, actually, my wife says that the only times Jesus breaks the Sabbath is to heal people. Mm-hmm. And I think she's located 7 times, and it's always to heal people. And that's an important, it's not just that he's breaking the Sabbath to break the Sabbath. It's for a specific purpose to restore people to community and to themselves.
Because all 7 times, these were people that had been cast out of society for whatever it is that ailed them.
Right. I think that's the heart of the gospel is that we're created for communion with God, with one another, and with ourselves.
Jeremy thinks that Jesus did the miracles simply so that he could point and laugh at people. But
I mean,
That's how bankers are.
If I was Jesus, I'd be like, watch this guy. That's cool.
he just wanted to rub it in on the disciples. Say, you couldn't do this. No, that's Jeremy's theory.
I'm like, let one more Pharisee tell me what I don't know. Show them. One of the many reasons we should all be glad I'm not Jesus.
I'm known for asking the dumb question on the show, and you're an educator, and you're probably going to say there are no such thing as dumb questions, but you haven't talked to me before. So when we first saw your name on the website to let us know that you were speaking at conference, I immediately thought, I wonder if once he got his PhD, if he said, I'd much rather have gone to archaeology and been like that other Dr. Jones. Did that ever cross your mind?
Oh, sure. That's crossed my mind. So when people call me Dean Jones, I think of the actor in The Love Bug. But what I really think most about, so my fantasy is not to go back to banking, although I've always been interested in some of those kinds of questions. But my fantasy has always been to be a sportscaster. And so I'd love to be Dr. Jones or Dean Jones. But what I'd really long for, if I had the skills, would be to be a broadcaster televising various sporting events, because I'll watch just about anything. My wife says I'll watch ESPNU with directional schools playing tennis against each other. So that's the real fantasy.
And Duke's got a pretty good basketball program to watch.
They do indeed.
They've had a little success over the years.
Yeah, their coach is a pretty good recruiter and game coach, and does pretty well.
He calls you for advice on the regular.
Oh, I wish.
And your football team is not as bad as it used to be.
That's right. No, it's the football coach is a guy who had a winning record at Ole Miss in the SEC, and he got fired after one 7-5 season. He said, "I came to Duke with 6-6, and I was anointed king of the universe."
Yes.
But Duke will always be a basketball school.
Oh, it will always be a basketball school. Although I don't envy whoever it is who succeeds Coach K. He will likely have a short tenure.
They should just call him an interim.
Yeah, it will be an unintentional interim if it isn't a formal interim.
It's just like when you follow the guy at a church, the beloved pastor. I'm just an interim.
Yeah.
just filling the seat until.
Indeed.
Well, go ahead.
I was going to ask the question you were going to ask.
Well, then go ahead.
All right.
I don't want to steal your thunder.
All right. There's a question we've been asking people lately on the show as we wrap up. What is it that's saving your soul right now? What is it that is moving you forward? However you want to phrase that. And this isn't one of those Sunday school questions. You don't have to say Jesus. We figured that's already happened.
I'd say probably both in a superficial and in a really deep way. The birth of my granddaughters. And I say that partly in a superficial way because there's something about grandparenting that I say it's the only thing in the world that's not overrated. And they're at a kind of superficial level. My granddaughter, my oldest one, is 2, and she now just lights up when I see her, and that's just brings joy. And when she ran in the airport, and when she first saw me and ran at the airport at the end, I'd had a really terrible day. I just thought, okay, I'm good. And so I remember that sort of thing when I hit a wall or I'm dealing with muck and adults and everything. In a profound sense, I'd say though, I'm now much more. I feel much more profound sense of urgency to try to improve the world for those granddaughters. That I'm more anxious about what kind of world we're leaving them to grow up in. And that includes the church, it includes vocations in medicine and nursing and law and teaching. I just have a profound sense that I want my life to be focused on the things that will last and help make them better. There's a phrase, it's a common phrase about planting trees under whose shade you will not sit. The interesting thing is we don't have a word that actually summarizes that. And I now think that that's the most important things I can do in life is to help plant trees under whose shade my granddaughters will sit.
If people would like to learn more about you, contact you, how can they do that? Because we know you've written a couple of books, and somebody might need to, beg you to say something good about me so I can get in your school.
Well, I'm a compulsive emailer, so you can reach me at l.gregory.jones@duke.edu. And I'm sufficiently neurotic that I can't go to bed at night if I have a number on my phone, so that I have to play back words with friends to the people I'm playing with, and I have to have opened all my emails before I can go to sleep comfortably at night. So I do read and respond to emails pretty regularly.
Yeah. And what is your current book project? You have a couple that have come out recently. Anything you want to plug there?
Well, I did this little book called Christian Social Innovation, Renewing Wesleyan Witness. That's a pretty readable book, small. You can also say you finished it without too much difficulty. I'm working on another book that's called Navigating the Future, on practicing tradition to innovation as a way of life. Hoping to finish it sometime this year.
Dr. Jones, thank you. Thank you for spending time with us today.
Great to be with you both.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks.